The stars were dying. Captain Jake Morrison pressed his face against the cold window of his ship and watched the last evacuation ships flee from the Centauri colonies. Tiny lights blinked in the darkness as families packed their entire lives into cargo containers, leaving behind homes they had built over generations. In less than a week, this entire system would be empty. Dead. Gone. Jake turned away from the window and walked back to his command chair. The bridge of the human vessel Defiant Dawn buzzed with quiet activity. His crew worked at their stations, with the kind of focused calm that came from knowing death was coming, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. They had seen the reports. They knew what happened to worlds that stood in the path of the Void Plague. The plague had started 3 months ago at the edge of the galaxy. At first, the reports seemed impossible. Entire star systems just vanishing. Not destroyed, not conquered, but simply erased from existence as if they had never been there at all. The Galactic Council had dismissed the early warnings as censor errors or communication failures. After all, how could something just delete a planet from reality? But the reports kept coming. And they got worse. The plague was not like any enemy the galaxy had ever faced. It was not an army with ships and weapons. It was not a disease that killed living things. It was something far more terrible. It was a darkness that consumed everything. It touched matter, energy, space, time. Even the basic laws of physics seemed to break down when the plague arrived. Scientists called it the Void Plague because that was all it left behind. Empty void where worlds and stars had once existed. Jake looked at the tactical display showing the plague's advance through the galaxy. Red zones marked areas where the plague had already passed. Yellow zones showed systems under evacuation. Green zones indicated places that were still safe, though that safety was temporary. The red zones grew larger every day. Dr. Elena Vasquez burst through the bridge doors, her lab coat wrinkled and stained. She had not slept in 2 days, working frantically with her research team to understand what they were fighting. Her dark hair hung loose around her face, and her eyes held the kind of desperate energy that came from knowing you were running out of time. "Jake, I found something," she said, rushing to his chair. She clutched a data pad against her chest, like it contained the secrets of the universe. "The plague is not what we thought it was." Jake motioned for her to continue. Around them, the bridge crew tried to look busy while listening to every word. They all knew their lives might depend on whatever Elena had discovered. "We thought the plague just consumed matter and energy," Elena said, her words coming fast with excitement. "But that is not right. It feeds on something else. Something we never thought to measure." She activated her datapad and showed Jake a series of graphs and charts that meant nothing to him. "Elena, I need simple words," Jake said. "What did you find?" Elena took a deep breath and forced herself to slow down. "The plague feeds on fear, Jake, on despair, on the feeling of hopelessness. That spreads when people realize they are going to die and there is nothing they can do about it. That is what gives it power, but there is something else. Something it cannot digest." Before Jake could ask what she meant, his communications officer called out from across the bridge. "Captain, we are getting reports from the Kepler 442b garrison. Commander Butler is requesting immediate assistance." Jake nodded and activated the main screen. The image of Commander Rex Butler appeared, his square face grim under his military cap. Behind him, Jake could see the controlled chaos of a military base preparing for siege. Butler had been Jake's friend for 15 years, ever since they had served together in the border conflicts with the Bruton Empire. "Jake, we have got a situation here," Butler said without ceremony. "Refugee ships are pouring through our system. Thousands of them. They are telling stories that do not make sense. Worlds that just stopped existing. Entire fleets that vanished. Between one sensor sweep and the next." Jake studied his friend's face, Butler was not a man who scared easily. He had led Marines through the worst fighting the galaxy had ever seen. But now there was something in his eyes that Jake had never seen before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of deep weariness that came from facing an enemy you could not understand. "How long do you think you have?" Jake asked. Butler was quiet for a moment, consulting something off screen. "Our best estimates say the plague will reach our system in 6 days, maybe 7 if we are lucky." He paused, then added, "Jake, these refugees are not just scared. They are broken. They have seen things that should not be possible. I have got families here who watch their home worlds just blink out of existence. One minute their planet was there, the next minute there was nothing but empty space." The communication ended, leaving the bridge in uncomfortable silence. Jake looked back at Alina, who was staring at her datapad with renewed intensity. "You said the plague cannot digest something," Jake said. "What?" Alina looked up at him, and for the first time in weeks, there was hope in her eyes. "Humans, Jake. It cannot digest humans, not completely." The bridge crew stopped pretending to work and turned to stare at her. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. "What do you mean?" "I analyzed the energy signatures from every system the plague has consumed," Alina explained. "In most cases, the pattern is the same. The plague arrives, feeds on the fear and despair of the population, then consumes everything. But in systems with human colonies, something different happens. The plague slows down, it struggles, and sometimes, just sometimes, it retreats." Jake stood up from his chair and walked over to Alina. "Are you saying humans are immune to this thing?" "Not immune," Alina said, shaking her head, "but resistant. There is something about the way human brains work, the way we respond to impossible situations, that the plague finds difficult to process. We call it defiant resonance." "Defiant resonance?" "When humans face certain death, when we are backed into a corner with no way out, we do not just give up. We get angry, we fight back, even when fighting back is pointless. Even when we know we are going to lose. That anger, that refusal to accept defeat, creates a kind of energy pattern that the plague cannot feed on." Jake processed this information, his mind racing through the implications. How many humans are there in the galaxy? "About 8 billion across all colonies and ships," Alina replied. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tactical display. 8 billion humans scattered across hundreds of worlds and thousands of ships, against a force that had already consumed billions of other beings, and showed no signs of slowing down. "Alina," Jake said finally, "do you think this defiant resonance could stop the plague completely?" Alina hesitated. "I do not know, maybe, if we could get enough humans in the right positions, create a network of resistance points across the galaxy." She trailed off, seeming to realize what she was suggesting. Jake understood. She was talking about using every human in the galaxy as bait, positioning them directly in the path of the plague, hoping their natural defiance would be enough to stop a force that had already proven unstoppable. It was insane. It was impossible. It was exactly the kind of desperate, hopeless plan that humans were known for attempting, and it might be their only chance. The great crystal chambers of Nexus Prime had never seen such chaos. Representatives from across the galaxy gathered in emergency session, their forms flickering as holograms transmitted from worlds already under evacuation. The massive chamber, built to showcase the unity and power of galactic civilization, now echoed with the sounds of panic and despair. Ambassador Lisa Park stood at the human delegation's small platform, watching the scene unfold around her. The Altarians, with their crystalline bodies that normally pulsed with calm blue light, now flickered with erratic patterns of red and orange. Their mathematical minds, capable of calculating the movement of entire star systems, had run every possible scenario and found only one conclusion. Extinction was inevitable. High Counselor Vex of the Altarians raised his translucent hand for silence. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of absolute certainty that came from pure logic. Fellow beings of the galaxy, our projections are complete. The Void Plague will reach the core worlds within 47 standard cycles. Based on current rates of consumption and spread, we calculate a 97.3% probability of total galactic extinction within 1 standard year. The chamber fell silent except for the soft, mournful harmonics of the Verdani delegate. The tree-like beings communicated through song, and their music now carried notes of such profound sadness that even species who could not understand their language felt the grief wash over them. Lisa looked around at the assembled representatives. These were the leaders of civilizations that had existed for thousands of years. The Altarians had built computers that could simulate entire universes. The Verdani had grown forests that spanned entire continents and sang songs that could be heard across star systems. The massive Brutans had conquered half the galaxy through sheer force of will and had never retreated from any battle. All of them were giving up. War leader Gorth of the Brutans slammed his massive fist on his platform, causing several smaller delegates to jump in surprise. His voice rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder. There must be a way to fight this thing. My warriors have faced every enemy the galaxy has ever produced. We do not run from battle. This is not a battle, war leader, replied Counselor Vex. This is a natural disaster on a galactic scale. You cannot fight the plague any more than you can fight the heat death of the universe itself. Then what do you suggest? Demanded Gorth. That we simply wait to die? The chamber erupted in arguments, as different species proposed impossible solutions. The Altarians wanted to build massive computational arrays that could somehow calculate a way out of the crisis. The Verdani suggested retreating to the galactic core and trying to sing the plague into submission. The Brutans wanted to gather every warship in the galaxy and charge directly into the plague's heart. Lisa listened to the chaos and felt something stir in her chest. It was the same feeling she had experienced as a child on Earth when her family had been trapped in a burning building. The same feeling she had felt as a young diplomat when hostile alien species had threatened to destroy human colonies. It was not fear, though fear was certainly present. It was something deeper and more fundamental. It was the refusal to accept that the story ended here. Lisa stepped forward and pressed the activation button on her platform. Her voice, amplified by the chamber's acoustics, cut through the noise. There is another option. The arguing stopped. Thousands of eyes, sensors, and other organs turned toward the small human figure standing at her platform. Lisa felt the weight of their attention, but did not back down. She had been dealing with beings who considered humans to be dangerous primitives for her entire diplomatic career. War leader Gorth's laughter boomed through the chamber. The Deathworlder speaks. Tell us, human, what wisdom does your violent little species offer? Will you suggest we simply attack the plague with nuclear weapons? Perhaps you think we should ram our ships into it? Lisa met his gaze without flinching. Actually, yes, that is exactly what I am suggesting. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was the silence of beings trying to process something that made no sense at all. Hi, Counselor Vex's form flickered with confusion. Ambassador Park, you cannot be serious. The plague has consumed entire battle fleets. It has erased planets from existence. What could ramming ships into it possibly accomplish? Lisa activated her personal data display and projected Elena's research findings into the center of the chamber. Charts and graphs showed the energy patterns Elena had discovered, the strange resonance that occurred when humans faced impossible odds. Dr. Elena Vasquez of our research division has made a discovery, Lisa said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. The plague feeds on fear and despair. It gains strength from the hopelessness of its victims. But there is something it cannot digest, something that makes it weak. And what is that? asked the Verdani delegate, their song voice carrying notes of desperate hope. Defiance, Lisa replied simply. The refusal to accept defeat. When humans face certain death, we do not despair. We get angry. We fight back, even when fighting back is pointless. This creates an energy pattern that the plague cannot process. She paused, letting the information sink in before continuing. We propose Operation Last Stand. Every human ship, every human colony, every human being in the galaxy, positioned at strategic points along the plague's advance. We will create a living barrier, a network of defiance that the plague cannot cross. The silence that followed was so complete that Lisa could hear her own heartbeat. She looked around the chamber at faces that showed every emotion from confusion to horror to something that might have been admiration. War Leader Gorth was the first to speak. Human, what you describe would require every member of your species to face certain death. How many humans exist in the galaxy? Approximately 8 billion across all colonies and ships, Lisa replied. 8 billion, repeated Counselor Vex, his form dimming with what might have been shock. Ambassador Park, you are suggesting that your entire species commits suicide to save the rest of us. Lisa felt that familiar stirring in her chest again. The same feeling that had driven humans to climb impossible mountains, to sail across dangerous oceans, to launch themselves into space on pillars of controlled explosions. The feeling that had made them the only species in the galaxy to evolve on a world that actively tried to kill them every single day. We are not committing suicide, she said firmly. We are choosing to fight. But you will all die, protested the Verdani delegate. Maybe, Lisa acknowledged. But maybe not. Dr. Vesquez believes that if we can create enough defiant resonance at enough strategic points, we might be able to stop the plague completely, or at least slow it down enough for the rest of the galaxy to find a real solution. And if you are wrong? Asked Gorth. Lisa looked directly at the massive Bruton warrior. Then we die fighting instead of dying afraid. And maybe, just maybe, we buy the rest of you enough time to find another way. The chamber erupted in discussion again, but this time it was different. The panic was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe just amazement that any species would even consider such a plan. High Counselor Vex raised his hand for silence again. When he spoke, his voice carried a tone Lisa had never heard from an Altarian before. Something that sounded almost like respect. Ambassador Park, I must ask you directly. Are you authorized to make this proposal on behalf of your entire species? Lisa thought about her answer. She had no authority to speak for 8 billion humans scattered across hundreds of worlds. She was just one diplomat representing one small species in a galaxy full of ancient civilizations. But she also knew her people. She knew what they would choose when faced with impossible odds. No, she said honestly, but I know humans. When we return to our worlds and explain the situation, when we tell them that the choice is between dying afraid or dying fighting for something bigger than ourselves, I know what they will choose. She paused, looking around the chamber one more time. We all know what they will choose. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Not to approve Operation Last Stand, which was beyond the Council's authority, but to provide humanity with every resource they needed to make their impossible choice. As the session ended and the delegates began to disperse, Lisa remained at her platform, staring at the data display still floating in the center of the chamber. 8 billion humans, one last desperate gamble. The kind of insane, hopeless plan that no rational species would ever attempt. It was the most human thing she had ever heard of. The message spread across human space like wildfire. From the crowded cities of Earth to the loneliest mining stations on the galactic rim, every human settlement received the same transmission. Ambassador Lisa Park's face appeared on screens. In living rooms, workshops, schools, and military bases. Her words were simple and direct, the way humans preferred their bad news delivered. "The galaxy is dying," she said, looking directly into the camera. "In less than 40 days, the void plague will reach the core worlds. Every projection shows the same result: complete extinction of all life in the galaxy." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "But we have found something. A way to fight back. It will require every human being to make a choice." In the small farming town of New Kansas on the colony world of Kepler 186, Mary Thompson sat at her kitchen table with her husband Tom and their 3 children. The family had moved to the frontier world 5 years ago, seeking the kind of simple life that was hard to find on the overcrowded inner worlds. They grew corn and wheat under an alien sun, and their children played in fields that stretched to the horizon. Mary held her youngest daughter Emma on her lap while Lisa Park explained Operation Last Stand. Tom's weathered hands gripped his coffee cup so tightly his knuckles turned white. Their older children, David and Sarah, listened with the kind of serious attention that children give to adults when they sense something important is happening. Every human ship, every human settlement, every human life, positioned at strategic points around the galaxy, Lisa continued. "We will create a barrier that the plague cannot cross. This is not a military order. This is not a draft. This is a choice that every human must make for themselves." The transmission ended, leaving the Thompson family sitting in silence around their kitchen table. Outside, the alien wind rustled through their cornfields, and the distant sounds of their neighbors' children playing drifted through the open windows. Tom was the first to speak. "They are asking us to die." Mary nodded, still holding Emma close. "They are asking us to choose how we die." On Earth, in the Great Assembly Hall of the Global Parliament, President Chun Williams faced a room full of elected representatives from every nation and territory on humanity's home world. The debate that followed was fierce but brief. Some argued that humanity had no obligation to save species that had looked down on them for centuries. Others questioned whether the plan could possibly work. But in the end, the vote was never really in doubt. Representative Jackson from the North American Federation stood at his podium, his voice carrying across the packed chamber. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about the old wars, back when humans still fought each other instead of exploring the stars. He said there were times when ordinary people had to choose between living on their knees or dying on their feet." He paused, looking around the room. "I think we all know what choice our ancestors would make. I think we all know what choice we have to make." The vote was unanimous. Earth would participate in Operation Last Stand. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Defiant Dawn, watching the largest gathering of human ships in galactic history. Vessels of every size and type had assembled at the rendezvous point near Jupiter. Military cruisers floated alongside converted cargo haulers. Passenger liners designed for luxury travel had been hastily equipped with weapons and armor. Even small personal craft, barely large enough for a single family, had joined the fleet. Dr. Elena Vasquez worked frantically in her mobile laboratory, coordinating with research teams across the galaxy. Her discovery about defiant resonance had sparked a desperate effort to understand exactly how human resistance to the plague worked. The results were both encouraging and terrifying. "The effect is stronger when humans are protecting something," she explained to Jake over the ship's communication system. "Family, friends, ideals, even complete strangers. The plague seems to recoil most when faced with humans who are dying for others rather than just for themselves." Jake nodded, though Lena could not see him. Around the bridge, his crew prepared for what they all knew would be their final mission. His communications officer, Lieutenant Roberts, had volunteered despite having a newborn daughter back on Earth. His weapons specialist, Sergeant Martinez, had 3 kids and a wife waiting for him on Mars. Every person on his ship had chosen to be here, knowing they would never see home again. On the frontier world of Kepler 442b, Commander Rex Butler faced a different kind of preparation. His military base had become a refugee center, packed with civilians from the outer colonies who had nowhere else to go. Families who had lost everything to the plague's advance now worked alongside his Marines, welding armor plating to civilian transports and learning to operate weapons they had never seen before. An old man named Frank, who had run a small restaurant on a now-dead world, stood next to a young Marine named Collins as they mounted a plasma cannon on what used to be a school bus. Frank's hands shook as he worked, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Never thought I would be fighting aliens at my age," Frank said, adjusting the weapon's targeting system with surprising skill. Collins grinned despite the situation. "Never thought I would be teaching a cook how to use military hardware." "I fed people for 40 years, Frank replied. "Now I guess I get to try something different." Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out on thousands of worlds and stations. Humans said goodbye to their families in converted school gymnasiums that had become briefing centers. Children too young to participate in the fighting created drawings for the adults who were leaving. Crude sketches of stars and spaceships decorated with the words, "Come home, and we love you," covered the walls of departure lounges, but not everyone was leaving. In many cases, entire families chose to stay together. The Thompson family on New Kansas decided that, if they were going to face the plague, they would do it as a unit. Tom taught his older children how to operate the emergency systems of their farm's life support equipment. Mary showed them how to use their hunting rifles, though everyone knew such weapons would be useless against the plague itself. "Why are we doing this?" asked David, the family's 12-year-old son, as he helped his father reinforce their farmhouse walls. Tom stopped working and looked at his son. "Because sometimes when bad things happen, you have to choose between being a victim or being a fighter. Even if fighting does not change the outcome, it changes who you are when you face that outcome." The alien species watched humanity's preparations with a mixture of awe and horror. The elegant Altarians ran calculations trying to understand the statistical impossibility of an entire species choosing collective sacrifice. Their mathematical minds could not process the emotional logic that drove human decision-making. The peaceful Verdani sang mourning songs that would later become the foundation of their greatest epic poems. Their tree-like forms swayed in harmonies that carried across entire continents, creating music that spoke of sacrifice and hope and the terrible beauty of choosing death over surrender. Even the proud Brutans, bred for war and conquest, felt something they had never experienced before. War leader Gorth stood in his command center, watching the human preparations through long-range sensors, and tried to understand what he was seeing. "They are not warriors," he said to his second-in-command. "Most of them are farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, parents. They have no training for this kind of battle." "Then why do they fight, war leader?" asked his aide. Gorth was quiet for a long moment, watching a human transport ship filled with civilian volunteers make its way toward a designated plague intercept point. "I do not know," he admitted finally, "but I wish I did." As the plague's leading edge continued its advance toward the first human positions, the galaxy held its breath. Real-time communication feeds showed small human outposts, sometimes just a single family on an isolated station, preparing to face an enemy that had consumed entire civilizations. The universe was about to learn what happened when an unstoppable force met the immovable object of human stubbornness. The first contact came at exactly 8:15 Galactic Standard Time at the Barnard Star Listening Post. Mike Chun, a communications technician, sat at his monitoring station while his wife Anna prepared their morning coffee. Their small outpost, barely large enough for 2 people, floated in the darkness between stars. They had volunteered to stay behind when the evacuation orders came, choosing to face whatever was coming together. Across the galaxy, billions of beings watched the live feeds as the plague's leading edge approached the human positions. The darkness that had consumed entire solar systems now moved toward a network of tiny outposts, isolated ships, and scattered settlements defended by nothing more than human determination. Mike's instruments began registering impossible readings. Space itself seemed to twist and bend as something vast and hungry approached their position. The stars outside their window started to dim, not from any natural cause, but as if reality itself was being drained of light and meaning. "Anna, you should see this," Mike called to his wife, his voice steady despite what his sensors were telling. Anna came over and looked at the display screens. The readings made no sense. Energy patterns that defied physics. Matter signatures that seemed to exist and not exist at the same time. And underneath it all, something that felt like hunger. An endless, terrible appetite that wanted to consume everything that had ever been or ever could be. "Is that it?" Anna asked quietly. "That's it," Mike confirmed. They held hands and watched as the plague struck their tiny station. The hull began to dissolve, not burning or breaking, but simply ceasing to exist. The familiar pattern began, the same process that had erased billions of lives across dozens of worlds. Reality wavered. The laws of physics bent and snapped. The very concept of existence started to unravel, but then something unprecedented happened. The plague's advance stopped. Mike and Anna felt it before they saw it. A warmth that seemed to come from inside their own hearts, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. Their small station was surrounded by a bubble of something the plague could not touch, could not understand, could not digest. Mike keyed his transmitter with shaking hands. "All stations, this is Barnard's post. The plague has made contact." "Repeat, the plague has made contact." He paused, looking at Anna, who squeezed his hand tighter. "And we're still here." The transmission reached human positions across the galaxy and sparked a wave of fierce joy. At isolated outposts and makeshift fortresses, humans who had been waiting to die suddenly realized they might have a chance to fight. Commander Rex Butler stood on the observation deck of his converted base on Kepler 442b, watching the plague's tendrils reach toward his world's atmosphere. His mixed force of Marines and civilians waited at their positions, weapons ready, though they all knew conventional arms would be useless against this enemy. The plague hit the planet's outer defenses like a wave of living darkness. Orbital platforms that had taken years to build simply vanished as the void touched them. The planet's protective magnetic field flickered and died. Atmospheric processors that had made the world habitable for humans stopped functioning as if they had never existed. But when the plague reached the surface, when it encountered the humans who had chosen to make their stand here, something extraordinary happened. The darkness met a wall of defiance that had been forged on a world where everything tried to kill you from the moment you were born. Old Frank, the former restaurant owner who had learned to operate a plasma cannon, stood next to young Marine Collins in their makeshift bunker. The plague's influence washed over them like a tide of despair, trying to fill their minds with hopelessness and fear. But Frank had survived the destruction of his world, had watched his life's work disappear into the void, and was still here, still fighting. "This thing wants us to give up," Frank said, his weathered hand steady on his weapon controls. "Wants us to lie down and die quietly." Collins grinned, though sweat ran down his face from the effort of resisting the plague's mental assault. "Guess it picked the wrong species to try that on." The plague pressed harder, sending waves of pure terror and despair toward the human defenders. But for every push of darkness, the humans pushed back with something the plague had never encountered in all its travels across the galaxy. They pushed back with stubbornness, with the absolute refusal to accept that the story ended here. At the Vega Nexus, Captain Jake Morrison's fleet faced the largest concentration of the plague's power. Hundreds of human ships, from massive military cruisers to tiny personal craft, hung in space before a manifestation of darkness so vast it blocked out entire star systems. "All ships, this is Morrison. Jake's voice crackled across the fleet channels. His bridge crew was dead around him, consumed by the plague's initial assault, but he remained at his post. Remember what we're fighting for. Not just our own species, but every living thing in this galaxy. Today we show the universe what humans do when backed into a corner. The human fleet charged directly into the plague's manifestations. Ships that should have been instantly consumed flew through impossible geometries of twisted spacetime. When conventional weapons failed, the crews rammed their vessels into the heart of the darkness. When their ships were destroyed, individual humans in environment suits continued the fight with nothing but determination and whatever weapons they could carry. Dr. Elena Vasquez, monitoring the battle from her mobile laboratory, watched her instruments record readings that should have been impossible. The defiant resonance was not just stopping the plague. It was pushing it back. Every human who died fighting generated a wave of something the plague could not process, could not consume, could not understand. On New Kansas, the Thompson family huddled in their reinforced farmhouse as the plague's influence swept across their world. Their cornfields withered and died. The alien sun above them flickered and went dark. The very air around them began to thin as the plague tried to erase their world from existence. But Tom Thompson held his family close and told them stories about their ancestors, about humans who had crossed dangerous oceans in wooden ships, about explorers who had climbed mountains that tried to kill them, about the first colonists who had left Earth on rockets built with primitive technology, not knowing if they would ever see home again. "We come from people who never gave up," he told his children as reality bent and twisted around their small sanctuary. "And we don't give up either." Young Emma, barely 5 years old, looked up at her father with eyes that held no fear. "Are we going to win, Daddy?" Tom looked down at his daughter, at his family, at everything he was willing to die to protect. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to try." Across the galaxy, the battle raged in ways that defied every law of physics and probability. Humans faced impossible odds with the same stubborn determination their species had always shown. When confronted with extinction, they sang songs from their home world. They told jokes in the face of cosmic horror. They held hands and refused to let go, even as the universe tried to convince them that hope was meaningless. And slowly, impossibly, the plague began to falter. At Barnard's star, Mike Chun watched his instruments as the readings changed. The plague's energy patterns, so confident and overwhelming just hours before, now showed signs of confusion and uncertainty. It pressed against the bubble of defiant resonance around their station, probing for weakness, but found only 2 humans, who absolutely refused to be erased. "Anna," Mike said, his voice filled with wonder, "I think it's working." Anna squeezed his hand tighter and smiled. "Of course it's working. We're human." The plague's retreat began at exactly 1427 Galactic Standard Time, marked by the moment when technician Mike Chun transmitted his final message to the galaxy. "Tell our daughter we held the line," he said, just before his small station was finally consumed by the darkness. But something had changed. The plague's victory was no longer inevitable. For the first time since it had begun its march across the galaxy, the unstoppable force had met something it could not overcome. It had met humanity. The moment Mike Chun died at Barnard's star, something impossible happened across the galaxy. His final transmission had been simple and human, filled with love for a daughter he would never see again. But those words, "Tell our daughter we held the line," became something more than just a message. They became a wave of pure defiant resonance that spread faster than light itself. On Kepler 442b, Commander Butler felt it first. A surge of warmth and strength that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Around him, his mixed force of Marines and civilians suddenly stood straighter, fought harder, pushed back against the plague with renewed determination. The darkness that had been slowly consuming their world began to hesitate, then retreat. Old Frank, still manning his plasma cannon beside young Marine Collins, felt tears running down his weathered cheeks. He did not know why he was crying, but somehow he understood that somewhere in the galaxy, another human had just made the ultimate sacrifice to protect people he would never meet. Did you feel that? Collins asked, his voice filled with wonder. Frank nodded. That was one of ours. Going out the right way. Captain Jake Morrison, alone on the bridge of his dying ship, smiled as he felt the wave of resonance wash over him. His crew was gone, his ship was falling apart around him. But for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt hope. Real, honest hope that they might actually win this impossible fight. He keyed his transmitter for what he knew would be the last time. All human positions, this is Morrison. Mike Chun just showed us how it's done. Now let's show this thing what happens when you mess with the human race. Morrison turned his ship directly toward the heart of the plague's manifestation at Vega, the Defiant Dawn. Her hull cracking and her systems failing, flew straight into the center of the cosmic horror that had consumed entire civilizations. Morrison's last words, broadcast on all frequencies, were simple and proud. Humanity endures. The explosion that followed was not nuclear or quantum or anything that conventional science could explain. It was purely human. A burst of defiant resonance so intense that it not only stopped the plague in its tracks, but began to heal the damage it had done. The darkness that had seemed so solid and permanent began to dissolve like smoke in a strong wind. Dr. Elena Vasquez, watching from her mobile laboratory, could barely believe the readings her instruments were showing. The plague was not just retreating. It was being unmade by contact with something it could never understand or digest. Each human death, each final act of defiance, created another wave of energy that the plague found toxic to its very existence. It's working, she whispered, then louder. It's actually working. On New Kansas, the Thompson family felt the change as reality reasserted itself around their farmhouse. The withered corn in their fields began to grow again. The alien sun flickered back to life. The air became breathable once more. Tom Thompson held his family close and felt something he had not dared to feel in weeks. Victory. Young Emma looked up at her father with bright eyes. "We won, didn't we, Daddy?" Tom smiled down at his daughter. "Yes, sweetheart, we won. But the cost had been terrible." As the plague dissolved and retreated, as dead worlds flickered back into existence and consumed solar systems reformed from the quantum foam, the galaxy began to count the price of victory. Of humanity's 8 billion souls, fewer than 2 million had survived. Most were children who had been evacuated to the deepest core worlds, along with a handful of researchers and support staff who had remained behind to document what happened. The silence that followed the plague's defeat was filled with a strange mixture of joy and grief. The galaxy had been saved, but the species that had saved it was almost gone. Ambassador Lisa Park, one of the few adult survivors, stood before the reconvened Galactic Council 3 months later. The great crystal chambers of Nexus Prime were quieter now, filled with representatives who spoke in hushed tones and looked at the small human delegation with something approaching reverence. High Counselor Vex of the Altarians spoke first, his crystalline form glowing with colors that indicated deep respect. "Ambassador Park, our calculations show that what your species accomplished should have been impossible. We have run the scenarios 10,000 times. There was no mathematical possibility of success." Lisa looked around at the assembled representatives. The Altarians who had calculated probabilities for millennia and found only extinction. The Verdani who had prepared songs of mourning and instead found themselves composing epics of sacrifice and heroism. The massive Brutans who had never retreated from any battle, but had been ready to flee from this one. "Sometimes," Lisa said quietly, "the most important things cannot be calculated." War leader Gorth stood at his platform, and for the first time in recorded history, A Bruton leader bowed to a member of another species. The Bruton Empire offers all of our resources to help raise and protect the surviving human children. We have learned something from your people that we never understood before. What is that? Lisa asked. That true strength is not about how hard you can hit, Gorth replied. It is about how much you are willing to sacrifice for others. The Verdani delegate began to sing, their voice carrying notes of such beauty that several council members openly wept. Their song told the story of the species that had saved the galaxy by embracing their own extinction, and promised that the tale would be remembered as long as any Verdani drew breath. The council voted unanimously to establish the human memorial, not just a monument, but a living promise. Every species would contribute to raising and educating the surviving human children, ensuring that the qualities that had saved the galaxy would never be lost. The children would learn not just human history and culture, but also the histories and cultures of every species in the galaxy. They would become bridges between worlds, carrying forward the best of what it meant to be human. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery came from Dr. Elena's final research notes, recovered from her laboratory ship after the battle. The defiant resonance was not unique to humans. It existed, dormant, in every sapient species in the galaxy. Humans had not just saved the galaxy by sacrificing themselves. They had shown every other species what they were capable of when pushed beyond their limits. Years later, when new threats emerged from the dark spaces between galaxies, they found a universe transformed. The elegant Altarians, inspired by human example, learned to fight with courage as well as calculation. The peaceful Verdani discovered that their songs could carry defiance as well as harmony. The warrior Brutons found strength not just in conquest, but in protection of the weak. 10-year-old Emma Thompson, now living on Nexus Prime as part of the Human Children's Program, stood in the memorial garden with her Altarian teacher, Master Quinn. They were looking at the great crystal monument that bore the names of every human who had died in Operation Last Stand. Tell me again about my parents, Emma asked, as she did every day. Master Quinn's form glowed with warm colors as he spoke. Your parents were farmers on a world called New Kansas. When the galaxy was dying, they chose to stay and fight instead of running away. They saved us all. Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened. And someday I'll be big enough to help save the galaxy too, right? Master Quinn's glow became even warmer. Yes, little one. But hopefully, because of what your people taught us, you will never have to face such darkness alone. The day Deathworlders Defied Extinction became more than a historical event. It became a promise that no matter how dark the universe became, somewhere in the galaxy, the spirit of defiance would endure. Not just in the children of Earth, but in every species that had learned what it truly meant to be human. The galaxy had learned to refuse surrender, and it would never be the same again.